All right, let's begin here. News of another interest rate hike in South Africa have no doubt received mixed reaction. This comes as central banks around the world have been hiking interest rates, saying this is done in an attempt to cool their economies as inflation spikes. But this has also added further pressure to the cost of living. Let's speak to Gqubule, who's the founding director at the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. Duma, thank you so much for taking our call. I know it's load shedding on your side, but we do appreciate it. You are unhappy with the decision by the Reserve Bank. In fact, you call it insanity. Tell us more.
Yes, okay. When the bank increases interest rates, it's meant to cool demand in the economy so that people are spending too much. But what is happening is that it happened at the same time that we're experiencing stage 5 and stage 6 load shedding, and Eskom has done the most effective job of decimating the economy. So to pile on more misery on top of the Eskom misery is absolute, it makes no sense whatsoever. You know, it's like prescribing a flu medicine to someone who's got a broken leg. Because the second issue is that, number one, interest rates can't solve what is a supply-side shock. So what we're seeing is a supply-side shock, the war in Ukraine, rising food prices. No matter how, if they increase it to 50%, it won't solve the underlying problem. Now, back to Eskom, Bongiwe, the cost of this thing to the economy in the first 6 months alone, I was looking for updated statistics. I haven't been able to find it. You know, that take into account the current load shedding. 200 billion rand in lost GDP. It's insane that on top of the loss of GDP of about 200 billion rands, they want to increase interest rates, which will exacerbate the problem and make it worse. And what people are forgetting is that the central bank didn't mention anywhere in the statement the effect of Eskom on the economy, and National Treasury never talks about the effect of Eskom on the economy. So they're not factoring this in their economic models and in their decisions, yeah.
And I mean, when you talk about what they say in their statements, I mean, they say that it's the spiraling cost of living as a result of increased food and fuel price increases. This was a much bigger threat to economic growth than, you know, rising rates. And you know, the Reserve Bank governor further adding that rates are a response to economic conditions and failure to deal.
They are the wrong response, because what we're seeing in Europe is that this is a supply-side problem. You deal with a supply-side problem at the source. So what countries are doing, they're experimenting with things they've never done before. Liz Truss in the UK, she's now introduced £150 billion to protect households from the rising gas prices. Other countries have done price caps. There are all sorts of things that countries are doing that we could have done. In South Africa, the fuel price, what about reducing the fuel levy again? Cut it out for the rest of the year. Let's deal with that directly. The Eskom NERSA price increase, interest rates will not solve that issue. Why doesn't the government cover the difference between the consumer? Let's have affordable price increases for electricity. So let's government cover the difference between the CPI and the cost, you know, the whatever Eskom is asking for. So there's so many things. If the government looked at what other countries are doing, and they're experimenting with industrial policy measures in the UK, in the US as well, with the Inflation Reduction Act. There's so many things that countries are doing that do not involve interest rates here. And I think interest rates are the wrong response, because inflation has peaked. Oil prices have come down sharply, and you're going to see every single forecast shows that inflation is going down. And core inflation is at 4.4%, and that's the number we should be looking at. Because that's a number that excludes the volatile oil prices and the volatile food prices, yeah.
And Duma, do you think, though, that these are conversations that are taken into account as the MPC meets to discuss the decision?
I think, you know, South Africans now understand why we must change the Eskom board. I think we must change the Monetary Policy Committee, the way they make decisions. Like, can you imagine that you're sitting with your boss at SABC and deciding on whatever you have to decide on? You will feel pressured to agree with your boss. So I just think that we need outside people who can feel the pain of ordinary South Africans on that Monetary Policy Committee. You can't have just employees of the central bank who are, who don't feel the pain of ordinary South Africans. Let's bring people from civil society onto that board and the Monetary Policy Committee. And by the way, in the UK, they also have external members of their Monetary Policy Committee. There are different models in which we can make this decision. But I think it's complete insanity for them to increasing interest rates. Yeah.
And Duma, one of the things, that you also touched on tonight, which I was going to ask you, is the pain ultimately that is then felt, by ordinary South Africans, you and I. And let's talk about that, because ultimately all of this continues to put further pressure to the consumers who are already under pressure.
And let us not forget that the pain of unemployment is worse than the pain of inflation. And you're now inflicting more unemployment of the people, because when the cumulative cost of this load shedding since 2018, when this new board came into power, this board was appointed and President Ramaphosa was appointed, is 700 billion rands. And that is the cost to the economy, jobs that could have been created if we hadn't had that load shedding. And then now the Reserve Bank is piling on the misery and making things worse. So unemployment is worse than inflation, and our inflation is transitory. We said so at the beginning. It was a temporary blip due to the war in Ukraine, and it is now fading out. World oil prices have come down, and that's it, yeah.
And Duma, just before I let you go, and I'm glad that the signal is really holding up. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on this one. You've alluded to it a little earlier on. We're seeing reports today in the Sunday Times suggesting that we could see a change in the Eskom board, but others are saying that there needs to be even further changes at Eskom other than the board. You also need to hold the executives to account, possibly change them, and all of that. How do you think? Do you think changing the board could help with what we're seeing at play at Eskom?
Yes, we need to change that board. Let me just say, I've said 700 billion rand, the cost of this load shedding. It's jobs that haven't been created. And yes, we must change the board. The president is listening to millions of South Africans who want that board to be changed. But he must go further than that. We need to change the CEO. We need to change the COO. We need to appoint a head of generation. That's number two. And then number three, when the president makes his announcement, I don't want to hear anything about IPPs. The most important number that we have is the energy availability factor. This board has decimated our plants, our energy availability. When he was saying he inherited a mess. The plants were working when he arrived, when the new board arrived in 2018. The energy availability was at 78%. It has crashed to about 50% 2 weeks ago and is now at about 56%. All South Africans must focus on this number. Let us hire an interim board and an interim CEO for 18 months with only one mandate, which is to get this energy availability factor back to 75. And then we won't have the so-called shortage of energy, because this so-called shortage of energy that Eskom always talks about, the 4,000 to 6,000, they created the shortfall and they're blaming everybody else except themselves. And I find myself having to defend Gqubule Mantashe, who I don't agree with on most issues. Anyway.
All right, Duma, thank you so much for your time. I wish we had more time so, you and I could talk about that very last point, but let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for talking to us. And let's see then if the president addresses the nation this week at all, if it does happen, if we are going to hear about this critical issue, as you raise it, of energy availability, because all of us are wondering where do things stand and how is it all going to unfold there. But let me leave you there for now. Thank you so much, Duma. Do appreciate your time. That was Gqubule, the founding director at the Center for Economic Development and Transformation.